Zhang, given to a woman in the palace. Behind a forbidden gate, moonlight moves through palace trees. Her beautiful eyes watch swallows sleeping in their nests. She pulls out her jade hairpins, lamplight her companion, trims the wicks, sets a trapped moth free to fly. So we continue with the heptasyllabic quatrains, and this is the second in this anthology by Zhang. Zhang has a total of 5 poems in this collection, of which 4 are the ones that we're going to be reading today and in the following days. So the previous one, I think, was a pentasyllabic quatrain, and now he has 4 heptasyllabic quatrains, one after the other. So probably, if not earlier, at least by the time of the anthologist of this book, Zhang was basically appreciated as a writer of quatrains. When we spoke about his first poem in the anthology, we explained a little bit about his life, but very briefly, we can just say that he was a relevant figure of late Tang poetry, that is to say, of the 9th century, and it wasn't too successful in office. He served in a series of minor posts and couldn't get further ahead because of the newly factional rivalry at the court. So basically, he spent most of his lifetime just traveling around and seeing the sights. And he composed a lot of travel poetry, which is represented in his corpus. So the poem that we're reading today is very similar to the 2 poems that we read before this one, Bai Juji's Concubine Song, Liu Juxi's Spring Song, and even earlier Wu Guang's In the Palace. It's that typical poem that has as its subject matter and as its protagonist a woman in the palace. I don't want to repeat myself a lot, especially if you've seen the previous videos. This is a genre of poetry that especially became popular in the period of disunion as part of a type of poetry generally called Kung Di Shi. There's palace-style poetry, which develops a tendency that had already been present in the poetry of the time of the picking object, Yung Wu Shi. In this case, we have women, but they are treated a bit like objects for the male gaze of the poet. Like they are just these beautiful women in the imperial harems, therefore out of sight of any person apart from the emperor. In jewel surroundings, they are gorgeous ladies and bedecked with silks and diamonds and whatever. But they're sad poems because generally they represent the languishing beauty. This woman, for some reason or other, is not in the emperor's graces, so she withers away, lonely and sad, in the palace precincts. And that's exactly the topic of this poem. This is a very good representative text of this type of poetry. That's its only topic. A paraphrase of this poem is: there's this woman in the palace late at night, can't sleep, she's sad, she hears the emperor having fun with other girls but not with him, perhaps. Although there's no explicit mention of that here, but it could be implied. And she's not enjoying her secluded life, and she would like to break free. And she does a little tender-like activity. We will comment it when we comment the second couplet. So this poem is a very good example also of a tendency that we've talked long and in a detailed way about the tendency of Tang poets sometimes to avoid the explicit statement of feeling on the part of the protagonists of the poem. Those feelings are meant to be read, are meant to be perceived obliquely, indirectly. So, for example, in this poem, the things that the protagonist sees and does, and the things that she does, they indicate what's her mood without any need of saying the woman is sad and feels oppressed and wants to be released. Okay, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. Behind a forbidden gate, moonlight moves through palace trees. Her beautiful eyes watch swallows sleeping in their nests. So as usual, the first couplet locates us in the chronotope of the poem. It generally sets the background. So Behind a forbidden gate, the beginning of the poem tells us where we are. We already know from the title that this is a poem that was presumably given to a woman in the palace, which would have been impossible, like, a poet like Zhang, who can't just go to the imperial palace and give a poem to a lady. He is recreating in his imagination a poem writing about her life, a life of one of these secluded beauties, and how he would like to give it to her, perhaps. So the poem, the title already says it's for a woman in the palace. If that is not sufficiently clear in the Chinese or in the translation, the first line and the first words, behind a forbidden gate, clearly indicates what type of palace woman we're talking about. An imperial concubine, an imperial wife, one of the women in the harem that are beyond the grasp of anybody else but the emperor and the eunuchs. So, behind a forbidden gate, the place where the emperor dwells, is generally called the forbidden city. So behind those gates, what happens? Well, we might imagine that there were some pavilions, but also some parks or gardens. Moonlight moves through palace trees. So this is a curious image. So we now know where we are in the imperial palace, in a garden. We know when we are. We're at night, not the season, but it's night. And we get an image of movement. Behind this gate, something moves. What moves? It's the moon. Not exactly the moon, the moonlight. The moonlight is moving through the palace trees. Now, this is an interesting image. We can imagine that this is what the woman is seeing while looking out of the window, but the choice by the poet of focalizing our view as readers and of focalizing the view of the woman on the moonlight moving through the palace trees is significant. It's not just describing an element of nature. There is a contrast between the moon that is unlocked, unfettered, the moonlight which is able to move around through the palace trees and beyond the palace, and those who might be inside the palace behind the forbidden gate. Now, the gate is forbidden. Humans can't just move in and out at pleasure. The moonlight can, and probably other entities can. So moonlight moves around. So the moonlight could be acting here as, and it could be acting here from the perspective of the protagonist as an entity that is free to roam about, unlike her. And you could also perhaps read a little bit of the poetic persona in the moon itself, because the poet, like the moon, is gazing into the forbidden city, and he, the poet, in his fictional recreation of this secluded palace beauty, he can roam and explore and see and describe, just like the moonlight can move around the palace trees. The second line continues with another example, a more specific one. Now, it's still a nature example, but it's not a heavenly body, it's an animal. And this happens a lot in these poems, that the images get more concrete and more down to earth. Her beautiful eyes watch swallows sleeping in their nests. So the lady is looking out, her beautiful eyes, she's a beautiful woman, of course, she's a palace lady, and she watches, she's in the moonlight, now she watches swallows sleeping in their nests. And again, these swallows act, they're not just an accidental image. I mean, we can imagine that the woman might have looked out of the window, seen the moonlight, and seen a nest of birds. But the fact that she focalizes on the moon that is moving and on the swallows is also significant. The swallows are sleeping because it's night, but the swallows, so they're not moving, but they're birds. If they wish, they can move about. Just like the moonlight, they are untied to the imperial quarters. So they are an image of something that can be free, even if right now it is not, because they're sleeping, so they can't move around. The woman is always in this deep slumber. She cannot escape from the imperial precincts. So two images of things that can move and that contrast with the concubine herself or the lady that cannot move beyond the quarters. Second couplet. Again, the second couplet zooms in. The first couplet described what the woman can see, but in the second couplet we get into the chambers of the lady and what she does. She pulls out her jade hairpins, lamplight her companion, trims the wicks, sets a trapped moth free to fly. So what does she do? Well, first she pulls out her jade hairpins. Jade hairpins are part of the apparel that a luxurious palace woman would have, and they're a precious material. So she takes the jade hairpins, lamplight her companion. So it's late at night probably. She's alone. We might have suspected this, but now, by the clear statement that her companion is the lamplight and nobody else, this loneliness gets emphasized. So she's surrounded by the dark with only this dim light making her company. And what does she do? Why has she pulled out her jade hairpins? She trims with them the wicks, sets a trapped moth free to fly. So this is, a very pathetic kind of image. So this woman so loves freedom, so misses the freedom that the moonlight and the swallows experience, that she feels sad because a little moth, attracted by the light of the lamp that is accompanying her, has gotten trapped maybe in the wax, or is circling around the candle. She sets it free. She trims the wick of the candle so that the moth can run away free. So even though she cannot be free herself, she's still empathetic enough or moved enough by her own plight to want even an insignificant insect who is attracted to a burning light to escape free and to not suffer death and confinement. So it's a very effective image of her as an active freer. And as I said, all these images of what she sees and what she does contribute to this feeling of to the reflection of the feelings of this trapped palace woman who doesn't open her lips, who doesn't mutter a word, but through what she sees and what she does, plainly tells us about how sad and melancholy and unhappy she is with her imprisoned life in this golden cage of the imperial palace. So quite a well-crafted poem, and that I think very successfully manages to, recreate this atmosphere and transmit this sort of message in a coded but easily readable way.